They say some places are better left forgotten, that the walls of certain buildings remember the horrors they've seen, and sometimes they don't let go. I didn't believe that until the night we stepped into Davenport Mortuary, a place where 12 people vanished without a trace, and where I discovered that the dead don't rest. They wait. I never believed in ghost stories. Sure, I enjoyed the occasional scary movie or urban legend, but I always thought of them as just that. Stories. Jake, on the other hand, thrived on anything that could make your skin crawl. So when he invited me, Claire, and Sam to spend the night at the old Davenport Mortuary, I should have known better than to say yes. "Come on, Ethan," Jake had said earlier that evening, grinning like a kid about to pull the ultimate prank. "You've got to admit it'll be fun. The place is practically begging to be explored." I didn't think fun was the right word for it. The Davenport Mortuary had been abandoned since the 1970s after 12 people vanished without a trace. Locals whispered about curses and vengeful spirits, but most people just avoided it altogether. Not Jake, though. He had a knack for sniffing out trouble, and somehow we always got dragged along. I sighed as I leaned against my car, waiting for the others to show up. The air was chilly, and the distant hum of the highway felt like the only sign of life in this forgotten part of town. A few minutes later, Claire's compact car pulled up, and Sam hopped out, clutching his backpack like it contained the Holy Grail. "I brought snacks," Sam announced, his voice carrying an edge of nervous excitement. "And, a flashlight. 2 flashlights." "Snacks?" Jake snorted as he sauntered up behind them. "We're going to a haunted mortuary, not a picnic." "You can never be too prepared," Sam shot back, frowning. Claire chuckled, brushing a strand of dark hair behind her ear as she joined us. She'd always been the calm, rational one in our group, though tonight even she looked a little uneasy. "Let's just get this over with," she muttered. The mortuary loomed at the end of the street, its outline stark against the moonlit sky. The building's facade was cracked and weathered, with ivy crawling up its sides like nature itself was trying to strangle the life out of it. A faded sign above the door barely clung to the rusted frame. Davenport Mortuary. Established, 1948. Jake led the way, flashlight in hand, as we approached the entrance. The air grew colder with every step, and a strange, oppressive silence swallowed the usual nighttime sounds. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of our footsteps on gravel. "This place gives me the creeps," Sam muttered, glancing over his shoulder. "Good," Jake replied with a grin. "That means it's working." The front door groaned as Jake pushed it open, revealing a yawning darkness beyond. I hesitated, my heart thudding in my chest, but the others filed in without a second thought. Not wanting to be the odd man out, I followed. Inside, the smell hit me first, a mix of mold, decay, and something metallic. My flashlight beam cut through the dust-heavy air, revealing cracked tiles, overturned furniture, and peeling wallpaper. The mortuary felt like a frozen moment in time, left to rot as the world moved on. "Ethan, look at this," Claire said, pointing to a plaque near the entryway. It listed the names of the mortuary's former staff, most of whom were among the 12 who disappeared. "Creepy, huh?" I nodded, though my attention was drawn to a distant sound, a faint creak like footsteps on old wood. I turned quickly, my flashlight swinging across the room, but there was nothing there. Just shadows. "Relax, man," Jake said, clapping me on the shoulder. "The ghosts aren't gonna bite. Yet." I forced a weak laugh, but my unease only deepened as we moved further inside. Somewhere, deep in the pit of my stomach, I had the sinking feeling that tonight would be anything but fun. The moment we stepped into the main hall, the air seemed heavier. It wasn't just the smell of mildew or the oppressive silence. It felt like the building itself was watching us. My flashlight beam caught dust motes swirling lazily in the air, and every step echoed off the cracked tiles like a warning. "Imagine what this place must have been like when it was still operational," Jake said, shining his flashlight toward a row of faded photographs on the wall. They depicted smiling employees, patients on stretchers, and shiny, sterile equipment. Now the photos were warped and discolored, their subjects almost ghostly. "I'd rather not," Claire muttered. hugging her arms to herself. As we moved through the mortuary, the faint creaking sound I'd heard earlier seemed to follow us. Sam's flashlight flickered briefly, and he smacked it against his palm with a shaky laugh. Cheap batteries. Should have checked before we came out here. Or maybe the ghosts are messing with you, Jake teased, his grin wide enough to flash in the dim light. We wandered into what must have been the preparation room. It was cluttered with overturned gurneys, rusty tools, and empty jars coated in grime. My flashlight lingered on a scalpel lying on the floor, its blade still sharp despite the years. I didn't want to think about what it had been used for. "Hey, check this out," Jake called from the corner of the room. He crouched over a stack of yellowed papers and held one up for us to see. "Death certificates. Dozens of them." "Put those down," Claire hissed, her voice low. "You don't know where they've been." Jake ignored her, flipping through the papers with a curious expression. "Most of these are from the same year, 1974. That's when the disappearances happened, right?" I nodded, my stomach tightening. Something about this place was starting to feel wrong, like we were trespassing somewhere we didn't belong, not just physically, but spiritually. The sound of shattering glass snapped us all to attention. Claire jumped, her flashlight whipping toward the far wall. A cracked jar had fallen from a shelf, spilling shards across the floor. "Okay, that wasn't me," Sam said, his voice trembling. "Relax," Jake said, though his grin faltered. "It's an old building. Stuff like that happens." We left the preparation room and continued down a narrow hallway. The walls were lined with small numbered doors, and it took me a moment to realize what they were. Storage drawers for corpses. I shuddered, quickening my pace to keep up with the others. At the end of the hall, we found a larger room. It was mostly empty except for a desk and a few toppled chairs, but something about it drew us inside. On the desk, an old leather-bound book sat open, its pages filled with spidery handwriting. "What is it?" Sam asked, leaning in to read over Jake's shoulder. "Some kind of journal," Jake replied, flipping through the pages. His flashlight beam illuminated passages filled with rambling words, symbols, and what looked like names, some crossed out, others underlined. One phrase kept repeating, scrawled in larger letters, "Do not open the locked room." "Locked room?" Claire asked, glancing nervously at the shadows around us. "Guess we'll find out," Jake said, his excitement returning. He grabbed the book and tucked it under his arm as we moved deeper into the mortuary. The deeper we ventured into the mortuary, the colder it became. It wasn't just the kind of cold you'd expect in an abandoned building. This felt different, unnatural, as if the temperature was being siphoned out of the air. Our flashlights barely seemed to cut through the darkness now. The beams illuminated only fragments of the space ahead, patches of wall, glimpses of floor, and shadows that seemed to shift just outside our vision. "Does anyone else feel like this place is getting smaller?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "It's just your imagination," Jake said, though his tone lacked its usual confidence. Finally, we reached the end of the hallway. There it was, the locked room. The door was massive, made of heavy steel and covered in rust. Someone, or something, had painted strange symbols on it in thick, black strokes. The markings were faded, but their shapes were still clear. Jagged lines, circles within circles, and what looked like clawed hands grasping at the edges. Above the door, scratched into the metal, were the words, "Leave them to rest." Sam hesitated, stepping back as his flashlight flickered again. "Guys, I don't think we should—" "Relax," Jake interrupted, already running his hand over the door. "This is it. This is what we came here for." "No," Claire said sharply. "We came here to look around, not to mess with whatever this is." Jake ignored her, tugging on the handle. The door didn't budge. "It's locked tight," he muttered, scanning the edges of the frame. "Maybe that's a good thing," I said, trying to keep the nervous edge out of my voice. But Jake wasn't listening. "Help me out, Ethan," he said, motioning to his bag. From it, he pulled a crowbar and handed it to me. "You're kidding, right?" I asked, staring at the tool like it was cursed. "Just hold the flashlight," Jake said, gripping the crowbar himself. I sighed and obliged, keeping the light steady as Jake jammed the crowbar into the gap between the door and its frame. The metal groaned under the pressure, and with a sickening snap, the lock broke. The door swung open slowly, revealing total darkness beyond. A smell wafted out, damp and sour, like rot mixed with stagnant air. I gagged, stepping back instinctively. "What the hell is that smell?" Claire said, covering her nose. Jake took a cautious step inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the black. The room was small and empty except for the walls. They were covered in scratches, deep gouges that crisscrossed over each other, as if dozens of people had clawed at them desperately. "Jesus," Sam whispered, staring wide-eyed at the marks. In the center of the room sat a low pedestal, and on it rested a single object, a book. Unlike the one we'd found earlier, this one looked ancient. Its cover was made of cracked leather, and its edges were bound with tarnished metal clasps. "Do not touch that," Claire said firmly, but Jake was already reaching for it. "Relax," he said again, the words sounding hollow now. "It's just a book." The moment his fingers brushed the cover, a sharp, bone-rattling sound erupted from the walls, a screech that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My flashlight flickered violently, and the room seemed to tilt, the shadows on the walls growing thicker, darker, more alive. "Jake!" Claire screamed. "Put it down!" But Jake didn't move. His face was frozen in a mixture of awe and terror as the book's clasps snapped open on their own. The pages fluttered, glowing faintly with an eerie green light. Suddenly, the shadows on the walls began to move, coalescing into shapes, figures. They looked human at first, but their forms were twisted, faces elongated with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. "Help us," one of them whispered, the voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Another figure stepped forward, its shadow stretching unnaturally long. Its hand reached out toward me, and for a moment, I thought I felt its icy fingers graze my arm. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. "We need to get out of here," I shouted. "Not yet," Jake snapped, his voice trembling but determined. He was staring at the figures with an almost manic intensity. "They're trying to tell us something." The whispering grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices that filled the room. My head felt like it was about to split open. "Please," one of the voices said, clearer than the others. "Free us, before it wakes." "It?" Claire asked, her voice barely audible over the din. Before anyone could answer, the pedestal began to shake violently. The book snapped shut, and the glowing light vanished, plunging the room into near darkness. "We're leaving," I said, grabbing Jake by the arm and yanking him toward the door. The others followed, and as we fled, I glanced back one last time. The shadows had stopped moving, but I could still feel their eyes on us. We barely made it back to the hallway before the door to the room slammed shut behind us with a deafening clang. The sound echoed down the corridor, cutting through the suffocating silence. My breath was ragged, and my hands shook as I gripped the flashlight, its weak beam dancing on the cracked tiles. What the hell just happened?" Sam stammered, his face pale. "I don't know," I muttered, my voice barely steady. "But we need to leave. Now." "No," Jake said, his voice firm despite the tremor in it. "We can't leave yet." "Are you insane?" Claire snapped. "You saw what was in there. Something's wrong with this place." Jake held up the old leather-bound book he'd grabbed from the room. Its cover gleamed faintly under his flashlight, and I swear I could feel it radiating cold. "They're trapped," he said, almost reverently. "The voices. They need our help." I stared at him in disbelief. "Did you miss the part where they said something about waking it? Whatever it is, we don't want to meet it." Jake shook his head, flipping the book open. The pages were filled with strange symbols, diagrams, and text in a language I didn't recognize. But there were other parts, names, dates, and phrases scrawled hastily in English. "Look," he said, pointing to a passage. "The ritual must not be completed. The keeper lies beneath, bound by the 13. "What does that even mean?" Sam asked, his voice cracking. "I don't know," Jake admitted. "But those voices, the shadows, they're the 13, the ones who disappeared." I felt a chill creep down my spine. Could that really be true? I didn't want to believe it, but the scratches on the walls, the desperate whispers, it all fit. Even if that's true, we're not the ones to fix this, Claire said. She turned on her heel and started toward the exit. I'm done. I'm leaving. She didn't make it far. A low, guttural sound rumbled through the hallway like a growl from deep underground. The lights from our flashlights flickered, dimming until the darkness pressed in on all sides. Do you hear that? Sam whispered, his voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, the air around us seemed to ripple. The shadows on the walls began to shift again, stretching unnaturally long and twisting into grotesque shapes. Faces appeared in the darkness, anguished, distorted faces with hollow eyes and mouths open in silent screams. Then, they spoke. You mustn't wake it. The voices layered over each other, a chorus of warnings that chilled me to the bone. Claire froze in place, her flashlight shaking in her hand. Jake took a step closer to the nearest shadow, his expression caught between awe and fear. We're not trying to wake anything, he said. We just want to help you. No help, one voice hissed. Only death. The faces disappeared, melting back into the darkness, but the oppressive weight in the air remained. Jake flipped frantically through the book, his hands trembling. There's got to be something in here. Something to finish what they started. Maybe they didn't finish it for a reason, I snapped. Sam let out a yelp, and we all turned to see him stumbling backward. His flashlight beam caught a shadowy hand retreating into the wall, its clawed fingers curling like it had just missed its grip on him. They're getting stronger, Sam said, his voice breaking. Because we opened that room, Claire said, her tone accusatory. We did this. You did this. Jake ignored her, focusing on the book. Here, he said, his voice urgent. This passage. It says we need to light the seal. That's how we set them free. Light the seal? I repeated, incredulous. Do you even know what that means? Jake turned back toward the locked room, his flashlight beam sweeping over the symbols on the door. These markings, they're the seal. If we finish the ritual and destroy the seal, we free the souls. And unleash whatever they were keeping trapped, Claire said. Jake shook his head. We can't just leave them like this. We have to try. Another growl reverberated through the hallway, louder this time. The floor beneath us vibrated slightly, and I felt my stomach drop. We don't have time for this, I said. Either we leave now, or we... I didn't get to finish. The growl turned into a roar, and the walls around us shuddered. The shadows began to pour out, no longer just faces or hands, but full figures. They swarmed toward us, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. Do something, Sam shouted. Jake fumbled with a lighter he'd pulled from his pocket, trying to ignite it as the figures closed in. The flame sputtered to life just as one of the shadows lunged at him, its claw-like hand swiping inches from his face. Jake pressed the lighter against the door's markings. The flame caught instantly, spreading along the lines of the symbols in a bright, unnatural glow. The shadows recoiled, screeching as the light from the door intensified. The roar from below grew louder, angrier, and then, just as suddenly as it started, the light extinguished. The hallway plunged into darkness once more. We need to run, I said, my voice shaking. Now. Jake hesitated, staring at the door as though he could will it to stay shut. But when the growl turned into a sound that could only be described as laughter, he nodded. We turned and ran, the shadows chasing us down the corridor like living nightmares. We sprinted down the hallway, but it felt endless, like the mortuary was shifting around us. The walls seemed closer, the shadows darker, and every step echoed back like a warning. My lungs burned, but I couldn't stop. None of us could. Behind us, the growl had deepened into a guttural roar, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the building itself. The air grew heavier with each passing second, thick and suffocating, as though something enormous and ancient were pressing against us. This isn't right, Claire gasped, clutching my arm. The exit should be here. It was right here. She was right. The hallway should have ended by now, but instead, it kept stretching forward into an infinite void of peeling wallpaper and flickering shadows. We're trapped, Sam said, his voice trembling. "It's not letting us out." As if in response, the shadows around us began to twist and writhe, forming shapes that clawed at the walls and floor. They moved with purpose now, converging toward the center of the hall behind us. And then, it came. The entity rose out of the darkness like smoke made flesh. It was impossibly tall, its gaunt frame stretching until its head nearly brushed the ceiling. Its face was featureless, save for its eyes, two glowing orbs that burned with a sickly, yellow-green light. The sight of them made my stomach churn, like staring into something that shouldn't exist. The shadows seemed to pour into it, coiling around its limbs and giving it shape. Its mouth, or what passed for one, opened wide, emitting a deep, reverberating growl that sent shivers down my spine. What is that?" Sam whispered, frozen in place. "The Keeper," Jake muttered, his voice barely audible. He clutched the book to his chest like a shield, but his usual confidence was gone. The entity took a step forward, its long, skeletal fingers dragging against the walls. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, but worse, grating and primal, as though it wanted to tear apart the very air around us. "We have to move," I said, pulling Claire forward. "Now!" We turned and ran again, but the hallway seemed to fight against us, twisting and buckling like it was alive. The shadows on the walls reached out, their clawed hands swiping inches from our faces. "It's hurting us," Jake said, his breath coming in short gasps. "It's not letting us leave." Sam stumbled, nearly falling, and I grabbed his arm to steady him. His flashlight dropped to the floor, its beam flickering wildly before cutting out completely. "Leave me," he yelled, panic overtaking him. "Just go." "We're not leaving you," I shouted back, dragging him to his feet. The growl from behind grew louder, deeper, and I could feel the vibrations in my chest. The entity was getting closer, its massive frame moving with a horrifying grace. Suddenly, the floor beneath us shuddered violently, sending all of us sprawling. A deafening crack split the air as the walls seemed to cave in, and then everything went silent. I turned my head slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. The entity stood mere feet away, its glowing eyes fixed on us. It raised one of its elongated arms, the shadows coiling around it like a serpent preparing to strike. "This is it," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. But before the creature could move, Jake did something I'll never forget. He opened the book. A blinding light erupted from its pages, illuminating the hallway and driving the shadows back momentarily. The entity let out a deafening roar, recoiling as if the light burned it. "Go!" Jake yelled, his face contorted with effort as he held the book open. "I can't hold it for long." None of us hesitated. We ran, the sound of the entity's roars and Jake's strained shouts echoing behind us. The hallway seemed to bend and warp as we ran, like the building itself was alive and trying to trap us. The roaring behind us grew fainter, but it didn't stop. It was as if the entity's rage reverberated through the walls, shaking the very foundation of the mortuary. "Keep going," I shouted, my voice hoarse, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince, Claire, Sam, or myself. Our flashlights barely cut through the oppressive darkness. The walls stretched endlessly on either side, lined with empty doors that seemed to rattle as we passed. A faint, otherworldly whisper trailed behind us, words I couldn't make out but didn't want to. "We're not going to make it," Sam gasped, stumbling again. "You will," Claire snapped, grabbing his arm and pulling him upright. Her determination was the only thing keeping us from collapsing under the weight of our terror. Suddenly, a faint glimmer appeared ahead. A door. Not just any door, the main entrance, the one we had come through hours earlier. It was partially ajar, and I could see the faint glow of moonlight spilling through the crack. "There!" I yelled, pointing. We surged forward, hope rekindling in our chests. But as we neared the door, the air seemed to shift. A wave of cold swept over us, and the door slammed shut with a thunderous bang. "No, no, no!" Claire screamed, throwing herself against the door and pounding on it. "We're so close." The roar returned, closer this time, and with it came the shadows. They poured down the hallway like a living tide, swallowing everything in their path. The entity wasn't far behind. I could feel its presence pressing down on us, suffocating and inescapable. Sam fell to his knees, shaking his head. "We're dead. It's over." "No!" I yelled, grabbing his shirt and pulling him back to his feet. "We're not giving up." Claire turned to me, her eyes wide with desperation. "Ethan, what do we do?" I had no idea. Every instinct told me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The door was sealed, and the hallway behind us was filled with writhing shadows. Then I saw it, the book, still clutched in Jake's hands. He had managed to hold it open just long enough for us to escape, but now it lay on the ground a few feet away, its pages fluttering faintly in the draft. "The book," I said, my voice trembling. "We have to use it." "Use it how?" Sam cried, staring at me like I'd lost my mind. "I don't know," I shouted back. "But it's the only chance we have." Claire hesitated, then nodded. She darted forward, snatching the book off the floor. The moment her hands touched it, the entity's roar grew deafening, and the shadows recoiled slightly, as if the book itself was a threat to them. "It doesn't like it," she said, flipping through the pages frantically. "There has to be something in here, something to stop it." The ground beneath us began to shake, cracks spidering across the tiles. The walls pulsed, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony that drowned out my thoughts. "Claire!" I yelled, gripping her shoulder. "Whatever you're going to do it now." She didn't answer, her eyes scanning the text with frantic intensity. The shadows closed in, clawing at the edges of our light, and for a moment, I thought it was too late. Then Claire screamed something, words I didn't understand, spoken in a language that felt older than the walls around us. The book exploded with light, blinding and searing. The shadows screeched and writhed, dissolving into nothingness as the entity let out one final ear-splitting roar. The ground shook violently, and then silence. The silence was deafening, almost worse than the roaring chaos that had consumed the mortuary moments ago. My ears rang as I blinked against the afterimage of the light that had burst from the book. For a brief, fragile second, it felt like we might have won. Claire dropped the book, her chest heaving with exhaustion. The glow around it faded, leaving the pages dark and lifeless. Sam leaned against the wall, his face pale, his legs barely holding him up. "Is it over?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer. Something wasn't right. The oppressive weight in the air hadn't lifted. It had only shifted. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable, like standing on thin ice. Then I heard it. A low, rumbling laugh. It wasn't loud like before, but it was more menacing, more deliberate. The floor trembled again, and the book at Claire's feet began to smolder, its edges curling and turning to ash. "No," Claire whispered, stepping back. "That's not possible." "It's still here," I said, my voice hollow. "We didn't stop it. We just—" A deafening crack interrupted me as the floor split wide open. Darkness poured out, thick and suffocating, as if the earth itself was bleeding shadows. From the void, the entity emerged, its form larger and more terrifying than before. Claire screamed, clutching at my arm. "What do we do now?" I looked at the book, or what was left of it, and then at the door, still sealed shut. The entity's glowing eyes burned into me, and I knew there was only one option left. "I'll hold it off," I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at me. "What?" "No!" Claire grabbed my shirt, shaking her head violently. "You can't." "I have to," I said, pulling her hand away. "You and Sam can get out while it's distracted. Someone has to stay or none of us make it." Before she could protest again, I turned and ran toward the entity. The ground buckled beneath me, the air growing colder with every step. But I didn't stop. The last thing I heard was Claire's voice, screaming my name, as the darkness swallowed me whole. The police found Claire wandering near the edge of town the next morning, barefoot and trembling. She couldn't explain how she'd escaped or what had happened in the Davenport Mortuary, only that Sam was gone, and so was I. They searched the site for days, but the building didn't match her story. The main entrance was sealed shut with rusted chains, the interior untouched by anything living for decades. No cracks in the floor, No strange symbols on the walls. No sign of us ever being there. But they missed something. Claire had dropped Sam's camera during the chaos, and when they reviewed the footage, the truth flickered briefly on the screen. The shadows, the faces, my voice yelling for them to run. And then, just before the video cut to static, there was a final frame of the entity's glowing eyes, burning in the dark. Claire never spoke about that night again. She left town a month later, unable to bear the whispers and side-eyes of those who thought she'd lost her mind. As for me, I think about that moment often, the instant I stepped toward the entity, knowing there was no coming back. I don't know where I am now. Maybe it's the room beneath the mortuary, or maybe it's somewhere worse. The others are here too. The 13 souls, still bound to this place. Their whispers fill the air around me, fragments of pleading and sorrow. The entity feeds on all of us, and with each passing moment, I feel myself fading further into the void. But sometimes when the air is still, I swear I can hear Claire's voice, and I hope, somehow, that she remembers mine.